Good afternoon and welcome to the program. I'm Ashley Gillen. As you can see, joining me on our panel of politicians this afternoon, the Liberal MP Steve Chobo. Good afternoon to you. And Labor MP Kelvin Thomson. Hello to you.
Good afternoon, Ashley.
Today we're going to be looking at the Climate Change Commission report. Today the Prime Minister's leapt on this report. She says it shows that it's time for Australia to move on from the debate about climate change science and instead focus on the way to tackle it. The report says the evidence that the world's surface is warming rapidly is overwhelming and clear. Its author, Will Stephan, argues that means the time to act is now.
What the science says is whatever you use, whether it's a market mechanism, a combination of mechanisms or whatever, they need to be effective and they need to be put in place very soon. That's the message of the report.
We have seen from these scientists in Canberra today, they're saying, why are we even still debating the climate change science? We should move on from that and look at how we're going to deal with it. Steve, some of your colleagues are among the most public climate change sceptics, people like Nick Minchin, Dennis Jensen. Are they fueling this fear and concern in the community about the actual science?
I think what matters, Ashley, is what the position of the coalition is, and the position of the coalition is very straightforward and very clear. And that is that we believe that climate change is happening, we believe that man is attributing to it, that we need to do something about it. That's part of the reason why the coalition obviously has a 5% reduction in normal business case emissions by 2020. Our policy in that respect is identical to Labor's. So, you know, it's okay for the Prime Minister to try to play politics on this and try to say that this is about whether or not we believe in climate change and so on and so forth. The reality is that's not what it's about. We have identical policies in terms of a reduction in emissions. Where there's a difference, though, is the way that we achieve that reduction in emissions. So, you know, I don't think that today does anything to change the current political debate. I think it's a shame the Prime Minister is still trying to play petty politics. But what we're going to continue to focus on are the policy differences between the coalition and Labor.
And of course, Tony Abbott has agreed today. He says his problem isn't with the science, it's with the carbon tax and the way the government wants to tackle it. But still, when you have people like Dennis Jensen coming through the doors of Parliament and making these sort of claims, let's just have a listen to some of Dennis Jensen.
I mean, there are scientists that say that at some stage it's inevitable that we're going to be hit by a meteor, by an asteroid. Does that mean that we should be taking action against that?
Those sorts of comments, Steve, it doesn't help the coalition's case and focusing on the carbon tax when there seems to be so many different views about the science and the need to even act in the first place.
Well, I don't think that we need to have every parliamentarian in the building, there's 226 of us, all singing from exactly the same hymn sheet. I mean, ultimately, people have a choice in terms of their policy response to this. You know, Kelvin has strong views about migration. I think probably not too much of a stretch to say that he'd like to see migration rates cut probably to zero, I'm not sure. But at the end of the day, his position isn't exactly in accordance with Labor leadership on that issue either. So what matters are the official positions of the parties. Labor and Liberal both want to see 5% reductions in emissions by 2020. We have a difference in opinion about how to achieve that, and I think that for Australians, they need to focus on those differences about how we actually achieve those cuts.
I do have to correct Steve there, talking about reducing migration to zero. My view is that we should be taking it back to the levels of the 1990s, 1980s, around net 70,000, so we do need to be clear about that.
The point remains there that Steve is making is that you disagree with Labor's policy when it comes to population issues.
I think we would be better served if we returned our migration policy to where it was in the 1990s, and better served if we moved to stabilise our population policy. I think that when you watch Dennis Jensen in action, he is seeking to run interference and undermine attempts to tackle climate change. Next he'll be coming into the Parliament demanding that we repeal the law of gravity. And the truth is, in relation to Tony Abbott, that he has never sought to encourage government action in this area. He apparently said that climate change is crap. You have never heard him out there saying this is a problem and talking to the public about the dangers of greater floods, of bushfires, of increased weather instability in future. He has never sought to promote the need for action in this area. The truth is the coalition has always run interference on this and sought to undermine action to reduce our carbon emissions.
The Prime Minister today is certainly urging Australians to ignore the sorts of criticisms we've heard from people like Dennis Jensen. Today she labelled them as a distraction. Here was Julia Gillard earlier.
We can't let this debate be waylaid by people who don't accept the science. No one in this country would have said it was acceptable to not fund Ian Fraser's cervical cancer vaccine because a radio personality thought that it wasn't going to be any good. No one would have accepted that. Well, the same applies to this debate.
Kelvin, this isn't the first time we've seen a report come out and say the evidence is clear, we need to act now. Professor Garnett has been saying this for years. His most recent report said that the science is more concrete than ever. So doesn't that mean, considering all the evidence is there for the government to be picking at, that you're just selling it so badly? You've had to hire this Climate Change Commission in the first place to go around and do a roadshow around the country to convince Australians of the science there, because the government has failed to sell that message in recent years.
When you say failing to sell the message, the truth is we were blocked in the last Parliament. We introduced legislation to produce a carbon pollution reduction scheme, to produce an emissions trading scheme. That legislation was blocked in the Senate, which is unfortunate. We should have had action happening now. Way back in 1995, the federal Labor government said it was going to cut our carbon emissions. We had the Kyoto Protocol in 1996-97, so people have indeed known about this problem for more than a decade. It is well past the time for action. We do need to be reducing our carbon emissions.
Looking at now, Australians aren't totally convinced that this is the way forward, a carbon tax, let alone convinced of the science, are they?
A clear majority of Australians understand the science and support the need for reduction in our carbon emissions.
But I think your plan is the right way to go.
I believe that people do need to be interested in the science, interested in the report of the Climate Commission, having a look at these findings, having a look at things like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, because we owe it to the next generation, to future generations, to understand this problem. One of the things that troubles me when I'm talking with people is a lack of understanding of the greenhouse effect. There are people who don't know the difference between the greenhouse effect and the hole in the ozone layer, and how greenhouse gases trap the heat from the sun and how they impact on our weather. So I think people do need to become more familiar with the detail of this issue and understand exactly what is at stake.
We saw that this Climate Change Commission report did also look at the direct action policy put forward by Tony Abbott and talked about the storing carbon in soils and trees, and that of course is a major part of what the coalition wants to do. But this Commission report points out that it's not going to do anything to reduce fossil fuel emissions, that focus on the soil carbon and whatever. It seems like this Commission is saying we need a market mechanism approach here, and yours doesn't offer that.
Well, actually, what ours does is provide flexibility, because let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here, and that is that Australia contributes 0.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I don't say that as a defence to say we shouldn't do anything, and indeed that's not Coalition's policy. We want to do something. Our difference is, as I said, about the approach that we take. But at the end of the day, when 2020 comes around, if there isn't global agreement about what should be done, then Australia can do all that it wants. I mean, we can effectively sell our manufacturing base, our extractive industry base, our services base back 30 years and put hundreds of thousands of people out of a job. It's not going to do anything to global warming, though, because the biggest emitters on the planet are the ones that still drive this change. So our policy has always been built around the frank assessment that unless we act in unison with other major emitters around the world, it's largely going to be a fairly Pyrrhic victory. And, I think it's incumbent upon the Labor Party to recognise, and Kelvin's critical of the coalition in this exercise, but I really think that the leadership of the country right now, people like Wayne Swan and Julia Gillard, have to wear a lot of the responsibility. I mean, if people are sceptical about what needs to happen, it's because only 8 days out from the election, Julia Gillard said there'll be no carbon tax under my government, and then only a week later is promising to introduce one. So that's where the cynicism comes from.
The Green Senator Christine Milne, her analysis of this report today is that it blows the coalition's plan for direct action right out of the water. Here's some of the senators speaking a little earlier.
Well, this report today blows Tony Abbott's climate program out of the water, absolutely. I don't know how he could possibly draw a conclusion from a report that says that you cannot just have offsets in the landscape. You have to reduce fossil fuel emissions plus restore carbon to the landscape and maintain it. 60% of the effort of Tony Abbott's direct action is in relation to soil carbon, and that is exactly the point Will Steffen is making. That is not enough.
Kelvin, having a Green senator, slamming the opposition, well, we know that Labor is in a very different spectrum as well when it comes to what sort of carbon price needs to be set, what sort of business compensation and industry compensation is going to be offered. Are the Greens in fantasy land on some of this stuff? Do you think Labor needs to distance yourself even further from them?
Well, we are working through the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee to come up with an agreed position to put a price on carbon and reduce carbon emissions. So we have responsibilities in that regard, and the Greens have responsibilities in that regard. Everyone has a responsibility to make something happen. You're quite right to point out earlier that it's been a long time, nothing has happened, or not enough has happened to start reducing our carbon emissions, and so we've all got a responsibility. We haven't, and the Greens have. And when Steve says we're not providing enough in the way of leadership, crikey, the Liberals had a leader in Malcolm Turnbull who believed in the need for action to reduce carbon emissions, and they got rid of him. They got rid of him precisely on this point. Precisely on this point.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull, you were close with Malcolm Turnbull when he was in the leadership, Steve. We've heard last week that he hasn't completely put away his leadership ambitions. Would you like to see Malcolm Turnbull return?
I don't think Malcolm could have made it any clearer than when he said that Tony Abbott would be leading us to the next election. So I know it's a topic of great interest for the media, Ashley, but I think that's put to bed. I mean, the reality is that the Coalition has a clear policy in this area. The reality is that the Greens attacking the Liberal Party is nothing new. This is coming from the party that wants $100 a tonne price on carbon. This is coming from a party that now effectively are looking over Julia Gillard's shoulder. I mean, Bob Brown was there looking over her shoulder when they made the press conference not that long ago about a carbon price. So, I think Australians rightfully should be sceptical about what the Greens are up to and assess them very closely, because this is a major political party now that holds the balance of power in the Senate. This is a major political party that has the ear of the Prime Minister. This is a major political party that is going to be pushing very strongly for a huge increase in the price per tonne of carbon. The impact on that across millions of jobs across the economy is going to be huge. So I think Australians should be looking very closely at the Greens and the amazing, huge influence that they have over the Prime Minister.
Okay, speaking of political parties, there could be a new one when we get to the next election. Bob Katter is thinking about starting a new political party. We'll have a look at that next after this quick break.